Hello everyone and welcome to week 12 of our course, where we will be continuing our discussion on macroeconomic variables. This week, really focusing on the Keynesian view of consumption, real GDP, and the multiplier. Before we get into our lecture though, there are two items that I would like to discuss, which are two very important assignments. Believe it or not, we are now entering the end of our course. And with the end of our course, we have to really start to focus on the final project and the final exam. We've taken quite a bit of time throughout the semester to discuss the final project and all of the different elements that go into that final project. In fact, we've had a few discussion posts centered around choosing a country and the different macroeconomic variables that you'll be looking up for that country. If you need a reminder of the different elements that will go into the final project, make sure you go to the left-hand pane of our course under Assignments and then click on the final project. That will represent 7.5% of your grade, and you'll receive a total score of 50 points for your final project. The second element is the final exam, which we haven't had too much of an opportunity to discuss, so let's go into that one with a little bit more detail. The final exam will consist of 50 questions. These 50 questions will all be multiple choice questions with 4 possible answers. It will be taken, like your other exams, in my econ lab. The difference being it will be a timed exam to 2.5 hours, which should give you plenty of time to answer 50 multiple choice questions. And this exam will not come from the Pearson test bank. The questions, rather, will be written by me. So, what should you do to review for the exam? I'd suggest 2 things. The first is to re-listen to the lectures. If you want to understand how I write questions and the material that I cover, a really good place to start is those lectures. So, when you're washing your dishes, when you're out for a run, it might be a good idea to re-listen to those lectures and give yourself an opportunity to review the material. The second place I would look, and perhaps the more important place, is the learning objectives of each assigned chapter. It's going to be on the first page of each chapter. And how I write final exams is I'll go through each one of these learning objectives and center a question around them. For example, the first learning objective of our first chapter that we read so long ago said, define economics, discuss the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. When I write exam questions, I am not trying to trick you. I am trying to reward the students who have taken the time to get to know the material and read each chapter of the book. So, that first question I might write would simply be, define economics. And there would be 4 multiple choice questions. Perhaps there would be one that says the relationship between money, stocks, and bonds. But within one of those answers, it would simply be the study of taking our unlimited wants and matching them to our limited resources, which is the definition within the book. If you have the time, I would suggest while you're taking this final exam to have your notes and the textbook nearby. And I say if you have the time because remember, this is a timed exam. You'll have 2.5 hours to answer 50 questions, which should be plenty of time to make sure to read the question, read the possible answers, reread the possible answers, and choose the best choice. With that out of the way, let's talk Chapter 12, and let's talk these three very important macroeconomic variables. Before we can really talk about the Keynesian view of consumption, we have to first define what real disposable income is. And you'll notice throughout this chapter, it is really math heavy. There's going to be a lot of different equations that you have to use throughout the homework and throughout the text. So if you haven't already, I would suggest getting out a pen and paper, getting out some note cards, and getting yourself familiar with each one of these equations. Back to real disposable income. Real disposable income is going to be our real income, which is our inflation-adjusted income, minus the amount of taxes paid within that economy. With real disposable income out of the way, let's talk about the two different elements that this real disposable income can be used for. First, it can be used for consumption. Consumption is defined as consumers taking their real disposable income and purchasing consumption goods within the economy. These are newly produced goods within the economy. The second thing that you and I can do with our real disposable income, which keep in mind is our real income, inflation-adjusted income, minus our taxes, is we can choose to save those funds. And our choice to save those funds can be influenced by a couple of things. First, it can be affected by the interest rate that's currently being offered. If interest rates are higher, we are probably more inclined to save more money. The second thing it's going to be influenced by is our future outlook on the economy. If that future outlook is negative and we feel like times are going to be tough moving forward, we're likely going to save more to account for the future. If we have a really positive outlook on the economy moving forward, well, things are going to be great in the next year and the year following. So let's go ahead, take our real disposable income and use it to consume. Finally, we can simply put all of this into one big master equation. And that master equation is consumption plus savings is equal to our real disposable income. The homework might have you rearrange that equation to something like consumption equals our real disposable income minus savings, or vice versa. But that is one equation you're going to want to know. One more element of consumption that we should talk about before moving on to a few other equations is this idea of autonomous consumption. Autonomous consumption is the part of our consumption that we are going to use independent of what our income is. Or, put in another way, a more simple way, this is the consumption that we are going to consume regardless of our income so that we can live. These are things like the clothes on our back, the food that we eat, and the house roof over our head. Even if we don't necessarily have our real disposable income to use on these autonomous goods, we'll go into debt in order to continue to live. Another autonomous good might be our medical expenses that are used to continue living. All right, with autonomous goods defined, let's go over a few different ratios the homework will have you calculate. The first one is APC, which stands for our average propensity to consume. And when we think of an average, we're typically thinking about a ratio of a whole. And APC is calculated by our consumption divided by our real disposable income. The next ratio is APS, or our average propensity to save, which is calculated by our savings divided by our real disposable income. The next equation will be our marginal propensity to consume. And whenever we hear the word marginal, what we should be thinking of is the difference from one year to the next. This is represented in statistics and econometrics by that little triangle symbol. So this is calculated by the change from one year to the next in real consumption divided by the change in real disposable income. So you're going to have to calculate two different subtraction equations and then divide them in order to get the marginal propensity to consume. The next one is MPS, which is marginal propensity to save, which is going to be the change in our savings from one year to the next. So we'll take that base year and subtract the next year. And we're going to divide that by our change in real disposable income. Where again, we're going to take that base year of real disposable income and subtract it by the next year. The final variable that we're going to talk about is going to be a very, very important ratio called the multiplier. And the multiplier is tricky because the homework is going to give you a lot of different variables, some which will be applicable to calculating the multiplier, some which will not. And the multiplier is unique because we can calculate it three different ways. The first one is a ratio of the change in the equilibrium of real GDP. So again, when we're hearing marginal or change, we're subtracting our base year by the next year, divided by our change in autonomous real expenditures. The multiplier can also be calculated if we're given this variable in the homework question as 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Finally, it can also be calculated by 1 divided by MPS. So, depending on what information you're given within the question, you are going to calculate the multiplier in different ways. The question may also just give you different elements of GDP itself, which remember is C plus I plus G plus our exports minus our imports, and ask you to calculate some of those variables just based on those different elements of GDP. Because this is going to be a pretty math-heavy homework, please feel free to reach out to me. If you have questions in regard to that homework, I'm always happy to walk through a question or an example or two to make sure that you're successful and that you're understanding the material well. Also, if you have any questions in regard to our final project or in regard to our final exam, again, reach out to me. You're probably not the only person with a question, and I will either post that in our general answers or our announcements if I get multiple questions in regard to the final project or the final exam. I hope that gets you started off well for Chapter 12, and we will talk very soon. Thanks.